Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was on one of those damp and mist-laden evenings in London when Dr. John Watson found himself once more in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The fireplace crackled softly, casting long shadows against the walls, lined with books, chemical apparatus, and the inevitable evidence of Sherlock Holmes's singular habits. A violin resting upon a pile of unread telegrams, a Persian slipper filled with tobacco, and, in the centre of it all, Holmes himself, stretched upon the settee, eyes half closed in contemplation. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the peaceful ambience. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps were heard retreating. Before she ushered in a visibly agitated man, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. His face was pale, his brows furrowed, and his usual self-assurance had given way to something resembling unease. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we've got a case on our hands that, frankly, has us all at a loss." Holmes opened one eye and gave a faint smile. "Excellent, Lestrade. Pray, continue. If Scotland Yard finds itself confounded, it must truly be an interesting puzzle." Lestrade sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "A murder in Bloomsbury, sir. A gentleman found dead in his own study. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, and yet—" He hesitated. Holmes sat up, his keen gaze fixing upon the inspector. "And yet—" Lestrade swallowed. "The body was discovered, wearing a golden mask. A most peculiar thing. The household servants swear the mask was not in the study before. No one saw anything unusual, and the doors were locked from the inside. We can't make heads or tails of it." Watson, who had remained silent until now, let out a low whistle. "A locked-room mystery, Holmes. It sounds rather extraordinary." Holmes steepled his fingers, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight. "Indeed, Watson. A dead man, a locked room, and a golden mask." His voice took on a note of fascination. "Lestrade, I believe you may have just presented us with something most stimulating." He sprang to his feet, reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot." The hansom cab rattled through the fog-drenched streets of London, its wheels cutting through the damp cobblestones as Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade made their way toward Bloomsbury. The gas lamps flickered dimly through the swirling mist, casting eerie shadows that only added to the strangeness of the case. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent since they had left Baker Street, his long fingers pressed together in thought, his sharp eyes fixed on the nothingness beyond the cab's window. Watson, accustomed to his friend's fits of intense concentration, refrained from interrupting. Lestrade, however, was less patient. "You're unusually quiet, Mr. Holmes," he ventured, shifting in his seat. "Something troubling you about the case?" Holmes turned to him with a slight smile. "Not troubling, Lestrade, merely intriguing. A dead man in a locked room, common enough. But the golden mask, that is what interests me. It suggests intention, a message perhaps, or a deception." Lestrade huffed. "Well, if it's a message, it's a blasted cryptic one. The man was Henry Wadsworth, retired solicitor, lived alone apart from his housekeeper, Miss Abigail Trent. Decent sort by all accounts, no known enemies. His clerk, a Mr. James Cooper, found him when he arrived for an appointment this morning. The door was locked from the inside, and when they finally forced their way in, there he was, sitting at his desk, slumped forward, dead, and that mask covering his face. The doctor says it wasn't natural causes, but there's not a mark on him. No wounds, no signs of struggle, nothing. Watson furrowed his brow. Poison, perhaps. Lestrade shook his head. We thought the same, but no glass, no bottle, nothing he could have taken it from. His papers were in order, nothing stolen, and the window was locked from the inside as well. It's as if the devil himself walked in, placed the mask on him, and vanished into thin air. Holmes let out a quiet chuckle. A most dramatic supposition, Lestrade, but I suspect the explanation, when we arrive at it, will be far more rational, though perhaps no less astonishing. The cab came to a halt in front of a stately townhouse on Bedford Square, its facade partially obscured by the thick London mist. A uniformed constable stood at the door, nodding grimly as he stepped aside to allow them entry. Inside, the house was quiet. The scent of old books and polished wood filled the air. Miss Abigail Trent, the housekeeper, stood wringing her hands in the corridor, her face pale and drawn. "I don't understand it, sir," she murmured. "I served Mr. Wadsworth his tea last night as always. He was in fine spirits. And now—" She shuddered. "Who would do such a thing?" Holmes regarded her keenly. "That is precisely what we intend to discover, Miss Trent. Now, if you will be so good as to lead us to the study." She nodded quickly and turned down the hall, her footsteps barely making a sound against the thick carpet. Holmes glanced at Watson, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Prepare yourself, my dear friend. I believe we are about to witness something most singular indeed. Early investigation." Miss Trent led them through the dimly lit corridor to a heavy oak door, now slightly ajar. The scent of candle wax and old parchment lingered in the air, mingling with the unmistakable stillness of death. As they stepped, inside, Watson's trained eye instinctively took in the scene. Henry Wadsworth's lifeless form slumped forward over his mahogany desk, his arms limp at his sides. But what truly commanded attention was the mask. It was golden, smooth, and finely crafted, covering the entire face of the deceased. The mask's polished surface reflected the flickering candlelight, giving it an eerie, lifelike sheen. Yet beneath the gleaming facade, Wadsworth's body was utterly still, an unsettling juxtaposition of the ornate and the lifeless. Blunkett moved forward without hesitation, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room. "Watson, what do you observe?" Watson stepped closer, his mind reverting to his medical training. "No visible wounds. The body appears undisturbed, save for its unnatural posture. Rigor mortis has set in, suggesting death occurred several hours ago, likely during the night. The fingers are slightly curled, relaxed rather than clenched, which suggests he did not struggle." He gestured toward the mask. "And this? It was placed on him post-mortem, surely?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "Quite so." He turned his attention to the rest of the room, pacing slowly. "Lestrade, you mentioned the door was locked from the inside?" "That's right," the inspector confirmed. "We had to break it down." Holmes approached the door, running his fingers along the latch. Then he moved to the windows, testing the locks. "Secure," he murmured. "No signs of forced entry. Curious." Watson, meanwhile, studied the desk. Papers lay neatly arranged, as if Wadsworth had been mid-task before death took him. A fountain pen rested beside an open ledger. The ink dried mid-stroke. He was writing when he died, Watson noted. The pen dropped from his hand, yet there is no sign of distress. Holmes glanced over his shoulder. "And yet, Watson, you overlook something vital. Observe the ink." Watson frowned and bent lower. The ink had indeed dried mid-stroke, but the last word was illegible, little more than a dark blot. He hesitated before he finished writing. Holmes mused. "Why?" He moved toward the body, and with utmost care lifted the golden mask. A collective hush fell over the room. Henry Wadsworth's face was frozen in an expression of mild surprise, his features unmarked. There was no sign of violence, no bruising, no indication of suffocation. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted, as if death had taken him in an instant. Holmes examined the mask itself, turning it over in his hands. The inner surface was smooth, except for something curious. Tiny, almost imperceptible indentations along the edges. He brought it close to his nose and inhaled. A moment later, his lips curved into a knowing smile. "Fascinating," he murmured. Lestrade crossed his arms impatiently. "Well, what do you make of it?" Holmes set the mask down with deliberate care. "Patience, Lestrade. I have a hypothesis forming, but I require further confirmation." He turned back to the desk and picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages with rapid precision. Then, abruptly, he stopped. His eyes flickered with interest as he ran his fingers over a specific entry. "Watson Lestrade, this case is already taking shape, but I require more information before I can speak with certainty. There are two individuals I wish to question, Mr. James Cooper, the clerk who discovered the body, and Miss Abigail Trent, the housekeeper. Let us summon them at once." Lestrade nodded and motioned for the constable outside to fetch the requested parties. Holmes tapped a finger against his chin, his expression unreadable. "We are missing a crucial piece of this puzzle, but it is within reach. I intend to find it before this night is over." The study remained cloaked in an uneasy silence as the constable departed to summon the clerk and the housekeeper. Holmes, ever restless when his mind was engaged, had taken to pacing the room, his fingers pressed together in contemplation. Watson, seated near the desk, kept his eyes on the peculiar golden mask, still lying where Holmes had placed it. Lestrade, on the other hand, looked eager to pin the crime on the first available suspect. Moments later, James Cooper was ushered into the room, a thin, wiry man in his early 40s, dressed in a modest suit. His nervous demeanour was evident. He twisted his hat in his hands as he glanced anxiously between Holmes, Lestrade, and the lifeless form of his former employer. "You were the one who discovered Mr. Wadsworth's body, I believe?" Holmes began smoothly. Cooper swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I arrived this morning at my usual time, just past 9, to review some legal documents with Mr. Wadsworth. When he didn't answer the door, I grew concerned. I fetched Miss Trent, but when she knocked and received no reply, we knew something was wrong. We tried the door, but it was locked from within. That's when we called for assistance and— He glanced again at the body, shuddering, and broke the door down. Holmes studied the man keenly. "Did your employer have any disputes of late? Any clients dissatisfied with his work?" Cooper hesitated. "None that I know of. Mr. Wadsworth was a fair man. Kept to himself mostly. There were no threats against him, no enemies that I'm aware of." Holmes's gaze sharpened. And what of his personal affairs? Was he involved in any unusual dealings? Cooper hesitated again, this time longer. His fingers tightened around his hat. I wouldn't know, sir. Mr. Wadsworth was a private man. He never shared personal matters with his employees." Holmes let out a soft hum of consideration. "Interesting. And tell me, when you entered the study, was anything out of place?" Cooper blinked, seemingly caught off guard. "No, sir. The room looked just as it always did, except for—" He motioned toward the mask, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That thing. I've never seen it before. It's ghastly." Holmes nodded as though filing away the information. "That will be all for now, Mr. Cooper. You may wait outside." As the clerk exited, Miss Trent was ushered in. The housekeeper looked visibly shaken, but composed herself with an air of determination. "Miss Trent," Holmes said kindly, "I realize this must be a trying time for you, but I must ask, when did you last see Mr. Wadsworth alive?" "Last night, sir," she replied promptly. "I brought him his evening tea at 8:30. He was working as usual. Nothing seemed amiss. That was the last I saw of him." Holmes tilted his head. "And did he mention any visitors or appointments?" Miss Trent pursed her lips. "No, sir. He rarely had visitors, especially at that hour." Watson, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. "Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Footsteps? Voices?" The housekeeper shook her head. "No, sir. The house was silent as always." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "And the mask, have you ever seen it before?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the object on the desk. "No, sir, never. It's an awful thing. Who would do such a thing to him?" Holmes's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, before he turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, do you still believe this to be a simple case of burglary gone wrong?" Lestrade frowned. "Well, there's no sign of forced entry, no robbery, and no obvious cause of death. I'll admit it's a puzzle. But mark my words, the answer lies with someone in this house." Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "Perhaps. But I suspect we are looking at something far more complex than mere opportunity. There is a method to this crime, and the true culprit is counting on us failing to see it." Lestrade exhaled through his nose. "And what do you propose, then?" Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "First, we must determine the significance of this mask. And secondly—" He turned his gaze toward the ledger on the desk. "We must decipher what Henry Wadsworth was trying to write before death took him." Holmes remained by the desk, his fingers gliding over the open ledger with the precision of a surgeon. The ink blot where Wadsworth's final words had been interrupted held his full attention. Lestrade and Watson watched in silence as he produced a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the page with keen scrutiny. The ink dried quickly, Holmes murmured, meaning he had only just dipped his pen before his hand faltered. "And note, Watson, The blot is irregular. As if his pen hesitated, trembled even before the stroke could be completed. Watson leaned in. You suspect he was already dying as he wrote? Holmes tapped the page lightly. Precisely. The act of writing this very word may have been his final conscious effort. The question is, what was he trying to say? Lestrade huffed. Looks like nothing more than a smudge to me. Holmes smiled faintly. To the untrained eye, perhaps. He turned to Watson. Would you be so good as to retrieve my chemical kit from the cab? I believe an ink reagent might allow us to decipher the faded remnants of the stroke. Watson nodded and exited, leaving Holmes alone with Lestrade in the dimly lit study. The inspector crossed his arms. You've got that look about you, Holmes. You've seen something, haven't you? Holmes chuckled. Lestrade, I see many things. The challenge is arranging them into a pattern that makes sense. Before Lestrade could respond, Watson returned, carrying a small case. Holmes swiftly extracted a vial of clear liquid and a fine brush, applying the reagent carefully to the ink blot. As they watched, faint traces of letters began to emerge. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Curious. Watson peered closer. It looks like M.A.S. Lestrade straightened. Mask? Holmes didn't reply immediately. Instead, he studied the letters for a moment longer, then leaned back with an expression of deep thought. A distinct possibility, but we must not let assumptions cloud our judgment. There is more at play here. Just then, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. A constable entered, tipping his hat. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but we found something peculiar in the waste bin of the downstairs parlour. Holmes gestured for the constable to proceed, and the man stepped forward, handing over a small crumpled piece of paper. Holmes carefully unfolded it, his eyes flicking over the contents. The writing was hurried, uneven, almost frantic. It watches! The golden mask! I understand now. Too late! A heavy silence settled over the room. Watson exhaled slowly. What in heaven's name does that mean? Holmes, however, remained composed. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I require one more favour. Lestrade grunted. I suppose you're about to tell me. Holmes smiled. I need access to Wadsworth's personal records, particularly any recent correspondence. Someone or something prompted him to write those words. If we can uncover what, we shall be one step closer to unveiling the true nature of this crime. Lestrade nodded. I'll have my men go through his files at once. Holmes turned back to the mask on the desk, his fingers brushing over the strange indentations on the inside. His expression was unreadable, but Watson recognized the glint in his eye. Sherlock Holmes had found something. The air inside Wadsworth's study had grown thick with tension, the mystery deepening with every clue uncovered. Holmes remained still, his long fingers drumming lightly on the desk, his sharp eyes fixed upon the golden mask. Watson had seen this expression before. It was the look Holmes wore when standing at the precipice of revelation, when the disparate pieces of a puzzle were beginning to align. Lestrade, meanwhile, had dispatched his men to search through Wadsworth's records, leaving the detective, the doctor, and the inspector alone with their thoughts. The ominous note found in the waste bin, it watches. The golden mask, I understand now, too late, loomed heavily in their minds. Holmes, Watson ventured, that note. Wadsworth clearly wrote it in fear. Could it be that he was being watched in his final hours? Holmes leaned back in the chair, steepling his fingers. A possibility, Watson, but there is something unnatural about his phrasing. It watches, not he or they. Lestrade scoffed. Superstition. No doubt, a man alone in his study, letting his imagination run wild. Happens more often than you'd think. Holmes arched a brow. A practical explanation, Inspector, but hardly satisfying. Wadsworth was not prone to hysteria. A legal mind such as his operates on logic. For him to have written these words suggests he had perceived something he believed was real. Before Lestrade could argue, there was a sharp rap at the door. One of the constables entered holding a bundle of letters. "Sir, we've gone through Wadsworth's personal correspondence. Found these among his most recent papers. Thought you'd want a look." Holmes took the bundle with keen interest and began sifting through the documents with his usual precision. Watson and Lestrade watched in silence as he discarded letter after letter, until one seemed to catch his attention. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Now, this is intriguing." He held up a short, hastily written note on fine parchment. "Mr. Wadsworth, the time has come to cease your inquiries. You do not understand what you are dealing with. I urge you, do not proceed further. Burn the mask. Forget what you have seen." The note was unsigned. Watson frowned. "A warning?" Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Sounds like a threat to me. That's enough to suspect foul play, wouldn't you say?" Holmes did not reply immediately. Instead, he flipped the letter over, scrutinizing the watermark. "Curious. This parchment bears an uncommon insignia, one used by an exclusive manufacturer in the West End of London. A detail worth pursuing." Watson cleared his throat. "Holmes, if Wadsworth had been warned to burn the mask, and yet it was found placed upon his face after death, then we must ask ourselves why the murderer did the very opposite of what this note demanded." Holmes finished. "An excellent observation, Watson. Either our culprit sought to punish him for ignoring the warning, or they wished to send a message." Before more could be said, a sudden commotion echoed from downstairs. A heavy crash, followed by raised voices. Lestrade was already moving toward the door, but Holmes was faster. They emerged into the corridor just in time to see a constable struggling to restrain James Cooper, the nervous clerk. His face was pale, his breath laboured, and his coat was torn as though he had been in a scuffle. "Let me go!" Cooper gasped. "I have to leave. I have to get out of here." "Calm yourself, man," Lestrade barked. "What's the meaning of this?" The constable tightened his grip on the struggling clerk. "Caught him trying to slip out the back door, sir. Looked like he was in a terrible hurry." Holmes approached slowly, his gaze unreadable. "Mr. Cooper, you seem distressed." Cooper's wild eyes flickered toward him. "You don't understand," he panted. "It's not safe here. None of us are safe." Holmes regarded him with interest. "Not safe, because of what happened to Mr. Wadsworth." Cooper swallowed hard. "Because of what's coming next." A heavy silence filled the corridor. Holmes did not blink. "And what, pray, is coming next?" Cooper trembled, his voice dropping to a whisper. He saw it, and now it sees us too. The words hung in the air like a chill in the bones. Holmes tilted his head. studying the terrified man before him. Then, without breaking his gaze, he spoke calmly to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe we should keep Mr. Cooper in custody for the time being. His panic suggests he knows more than he lets on." Lestrade nodded sharply, signalling the constables to escort the trembling clerk away. As they disappeared down the corridor, Watson turned to Holmes. "Do you believe him?" Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his chin. "I believe, Watson, that fear is a powerful force, but whether it stems from guilt or from something else entirely remains to be seen." He turned back toward the study, his sharp mind already working through the implications. The golden mask, the cryptic warning, the terrified clerk. Something was beginning to take shape, and Holmes intended to see it through to the end. The corridor remained eerily silent, even after James Cooper's panicked cries faded. Watson cast a wary glance at Holmes, who stood deep in thought, his fingers lightly drumming against his coat. Lestrade, ever the pragmatist, exhaled sharply. "Raving nonsense," the inspector muttered. "The man's scared out of his wits, but that doesn't mean there's some ghostly presence watching us." Holmes's lips curled slightly. "Ghosts do not frighten me, Inspector, but fear itself. Now that is a powerful tool. And Mr. Cooper's fear is not the mere product of superstition. He knows something that has driven him to the edge of reason." Watson stepped forward. "Then how do we proceed? You suspect he's involved?" Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily. A guilty man hides. He does not flee in terror while shouting riddles. No, Watson, Mr. Cooper is not the architect of this crime. He is merely another piece of the puzzle." Lestrade crossed his arms. "So, what's your next move, then?" Holmes turned toward the study, his sharp gaze falling once more on the golden mask. "We need to shift the game in our favor. Our adversary, whoever they may be, believes themselves unseen, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to misstep. It is time we force their hand." Watson knew that look well. The glint of challenge in Holmes's eyes, the hint of amusement at the chase. He was no longer merely solving a case. He was engaged in a battle of intellect. "And how do you intend to do that?" Watson asked. Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his chin. "We shall set a trap, but first we must ensure that our enemy believes they still have the upper hand." Lestrade sighed. "And what does that mean for the rest of us?" Holmes smiled thinly. "It means, Inspector, that we shall allow them to believe that we are in the dark while we, in reality, begin to close in." Later that evening the study was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting long shadows along the bookcases. Holmes had insisted that Watson and Lestrade keep up appearances, acting as if the investigation had reached an impasse. Meanwhile, he had sent a discreet message to one of his trusted informants, arranging a meeting under the cover of night. Holmes himself had vanished from Baker Street without explanation, instructing Watson to remain in the study until his return. Watson, though accustomed to his friend's sudden disappearances, could not shake an unsettling feeling as he sat alone in the armchair, the golden mask still resting ominously on the desk. Lestrade paced near the fireplace, arms crossed. "I don't like this. Holmes vanishing, leaving us here like sitting ducks. Feels like a fool's errand." Watson sighed. You know as well as I do that Holmes rarely acts without purpose. Whatever he's doing, it's vital to the case." Just then, a faint noise drifted through the house, a soft creak of floorboards, barely audible against the ticking of the grandfather clock. Watson and Lestrade exchanged glances, both reaching instinctively for their revolvers. A shadow flickered just beyond the doorway. Watson's pulse quickened. "Who's there?" No answer. Lestrade took a step forward, revolver in hand. "Come out, or I'll—" Before he could finish, a figure darted past the doorway, vanishing into the hall. "After them!" Lestrade shouted. Watson sprang to his feet, following the inspector as they rushed into the corridor. The flickering candlelight cast strange shapes along the walls, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed ahead of them. They reached the staircase just in time to see a dark-clad figure slipping through the back entrance. Lestrade cursed. "They're getting away!" But just as he lunged forward, another figure emerged from the shadows. Holmes. He raised a hand. "Let them go!" Lestrade froze. "What? Are you mad?" Holmes stepped forward, a satisfied glint in his eye. "On the contrary, Inspector, we now have exactly what we need." Watson, still breathless from the chase, stared at him in bewilderment. "You let them escape on purpose?" Holmes chuckled. "Indeed, and in doing so, I have confirmed my suspicions. Our enemy is watching us closely. But what they do not realize is that now we are watching them as well." Lestrade scowled. "And what, pray, did we gain from this?" Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small slip of paper. A message was left behind in Wadsworth's files. A name, an address, and I intend to pay them a visit before the night is through. Watson frowned. "And whose name is it?" Holmes smiled darkly. "The one person who may hold the answers we seek." The gas lamps flickered uncertainly as Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade stepped out into the damp London night. The address Holmes had extracted from Wadsworth's files led them through the twisting streets of Westminster, the city hushed under a shroud of fog. "Where exactly are we going, Holmes?" Watson asked, his breath misting in the cold air. "To the home of one Lord Alfred Blackwood," Holmes replied evenly. A name that, until now, had remained curiously absent from our investigation. Lestrade frowned. "Blackwood? The shipping magnate?" "Indeed," Holmes said, "a man of considerable wealth and influence. One who had every reason to keep Wadsworth silent." Watson's brow furrowed. "You believe Wadsworth uncovered something about Blackwood?" Holmes nodded. "I do not believe, I know. Consider the facts, Watson. Wadsworth was warned to burn the mask, yet it was found upon his face in death. He left a cryptic note suggesting he had seen something that watched him. And finally, we have a terrified witness, James Cooper, convinced that we too are being observed." Lestrade scoffed. "So what does that have to do with Blackwood?" Holmes cast him a sidelong glance. "Because, Inspector, Wadsworth was in possession of records that pointed directly to him, and if I am correct, Blackwood is not only connected to the mask, he is at the very centre of this mystery. They arrived at a grand estate, its iron gates gleaming in the moonlight. Holmes wasted no time, rapping the brass knocker firmly against the heavy oak door. A butler answered, his face impassive. "His lordship is not receiving visitors at this hour," the man stated curtly. Holmes smiled. "Then it is most fortunate that we are not visitors. We are here on behalf of Scotland Yard, concerning the death of Mr. Edmund Wadsworth." The butler hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Holmes caught it. "Very well," the man said, stepping aside. "This way." They were led through a lavishly decorated hall and into a study where Lord Blackwood sat in a high-backed chair by the fireplace. He was an imposing man with silver-streaked hair and a measured gaze. He regarded them coolly as they entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this unannounced visit?" Holmes stepped forward. "Lord Blackwood, we are investigating the murder of Edmund Wadsworth, a man who, until very recently, was in possession of a most unusual artifact, a golden mask. Tell me, does that mean anything to you?" Blackwood's expression did not change. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're referring to." Holmes sighed. I was hoping you'd take the more intelligent course and cooperate. But no matter. The truth will out regardless." Blackwood chuckled. "And what truth is that?" Holmes turned to Watson. "The mask, Watson. What do we know about it?" Watson hesitated. "Well, it was ornate, ancient-looking, clearly valuable." "Precisely," Holmes said, "and yet Wadsworth was instructed to destroy it. Why? Because the mask was not merely a relic, it was evidence." Blackwood's fingers tightened against the arm of his chair, but he remained silent. Holmes continued. "Wadsworth, in his legal work, must have stumbled upon something, perhaps old records, a forgotten ledger. And within those records he found proof that Blackwood's fortune was not entirely legitimate. Smuggling, perhaps. A relic of great worth, transported illegally." Lestrade stiffened. "A smuggling operation?" Holmes nodded. "Think, Inspector. A mask of significant antiquity. One that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Wadsworth discovered its origins, and for that he was silenced." Blackwood's jaw clenched. "You have no proof of these wild accusations." Holmes smiled. But that is where you are mistaken. You see, you made one critical error." Blackwood narrowed his eyes. "And what error is that?" Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a slip of parchment. The same warning Wadsworth had received. "You thought your message would deter him. When it did not, you arranged for his murder, ensuring the mask was placed upon him as a warning to anyone else who dared investigate further." For the first time, Blackwood's composure faltered. His gaze flicked toward the butler, who stood rigid by the door. Holmes caught the movement and smiled. So the loyal servant is not merely a butler, but an accomplice as well." Before Blackwood could react, Lestrade stepped forward. "That's enough. Lord Blackwood, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The room remained deathly silent as the inspector's words settled. Blackwood exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair. "You are a clever man, Mr. Holmes." Holmes dipped his head. "I have been told so," Lestrade signalled. His men, who stepped forward to escort Blackwood into custody. As he was led away, the butler made no move to protest, simply lowering his head as though accepting his own fate. As the door closed behind them, Watson turned to Holmes. "So, that is the end of it, then?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson, the end of a case, but not the end of the story." Watson frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes retrieved the golden mask from his pocket and held it up to the firelight. The mask was smuggled, yes, but where did it come from? What secrets does it still hold? Watson shivered as he stared at the ancient, expressionless face of the mask. Holmes murmured more to himself than anyone else. Perhaps some mysteries are never truly solved. A damp mist clung to Baker Street as Holmes and I returned from Scotland Yard, where Lord Blackwood had been formally charged. The gas lamps flickered dimly in the night, their glow barely piercing the swirling fog. Holmes walked at a measured pace, hands clasped behind his back, the golden mask tucked safely beneath his coat. "You are unusually quiet, Holmes," I remarked, watching his unreadable expression. "Surely you should be satisfied. Blackwood's arrest will put an end to his dealings, and justice has been served." Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "Justice, Watson. That is an illusion we tell ourselves when the story reaches a palatable conclusion." I frowned. "You mean to say you are not convinced of his guilt?" "Oh, Blackwood is guilty, make no mistake," Holmes said, his voice low, "but I fear he is not the only one. There is a larger game at play, one that remains hidden in the shadows." I hesitated. "You believe there is someone else involved?" Holmes stopped in front of our lodgings at 2 Baker Street, glancing toward the lamplit window of our sitting room. "Consider the facts, Watson. Blackwood orchestrated the smuggling of the golden mask, but was it truly for himself? Men like Blackwood rarely take direct risks. No, there is someone else, someone who desired this artifact so greatly that they would kill to keep it buried." The thought sent an uneasy chill through me. "Then what do you propose we do?" Holmes smiled faintly, pushing open the door. "We wait, my dear Watson. Those who covet secrets have a way of revealing themselves in time." The following morning Lestrade arrived at Baker Street shortly after dawn, looking uncharacteristically grim. Holmes had been reading the morning paper, but upon seeing the inspector's expression, he set it aside. "You look troubled, Lestrade," he said. Lestrade nodded. "Blackwood is dead." I started. "Dead? How?" The inspector exhaled. "Poison. He was found in his cell early this morning, a single scrap of paper clenched in his hand." Holmes leaned mournfully forward. "And what did it say?" Lestrade pulled a folded note from his pocket, placing it on the table. It contained only 3 words, scrawled in an unsteady hand. "The Watcher sees." A tense silence settled over the room. Holmes lifted the note between his fingers, studying it with a calculating gaze. "Blackwood was silenced," he murmured. "The question is, by whom?" I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. "You were right, Holmes. The case is not over." Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes dark with thought. "No, Watson. It is only just beginning." The fireplace crackled gently in 221 Baker Street, casting flickering shadows across the room. Holmes sat in his usual chair, steepling his fingers as he stared into the fire, lost in contemplation. The golden mask lay on the table before him, its ancient features unreadable, its secrets still lurking beneath the surface of our investigation. Lestrade had departed an hour ago, after delivering the chilling news of Lord Blackwood's untimely demise. The inspector was visibly shaken, though reluctant to admit it. He had expected the case to be neatly closed with Blackwood's arrest, but Holmes had anticipated otherwise. Poison, I muttered, breaking the silence. A man of Blackwood's influence should have been well guarded in custody, and yet someone reached him. Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. Indeed, Watson, someone with both the means and the motive. I glanced toward the ominous mask. And do you suspect this watcher? Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving the mask. A man like Blackwood does not act alone. He was the face of a far larger enterprise, an enterprise that now seeks to erase all traces of its existence. A cold sensation crept over me. Then we have not unravelled the full mystery at all. Holmes allowed himself a small, almost amused smile. We have merely scratched the surface, Watson. Outside, the fog pressed heavily against the window panes, a reminder of the unseen forces still at work in London's underbelly. What now? I asked. Holmes stretched his legs, reaching for his pipe. Now, my dear fellow, we wait. Whoever the watcher is, they will not remain in the shadows forever. In time, they will make a mistake, and when they do... He let the thought linger, striking a match and lighting his pipe. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of unfinished business settle over me. The case of the Golden Mask had been solved, at least in the eyes of Scotland Yard. But for Holmes and me, the lingering spectre of the Watcher ensured that our work was far from over. And so, as the embers burned low in the hearth and the city outside faded into the hush of midnight, I could not help but wonder what other unseen forces observed us from the darkness.